introduce myself really quickly. I'm Rajesh Kasturirangan, MIT PhD 2004 in Brain and Cognitive Science. And along with Dave Damloor, one of the co-founders of ClimateX, we think that climate action is one of the most important collective challenges of humanity today. And the more that we can bring together to address these challenges wherever they are, you could be, as some people are today, in Chile, in Mexico, in Boston, and Washington, D.C. It's fantastic to see people across the world being interested in this topic. And the faster we can collaborate and address this huge challenge, the better it is for all of us. And let me also then invite the two speakers today, Jeff Warren and Britta Voss, to say a couple of words about themselves.
Sure. All right, I'm Britta Voss. I am also an MIT alum. I earned my PhD in Earth Science in 2014. And since then, I've been a researcher with the U.S. Geological Survey in Colorado. And I just recently moved to Washington, D.C. for a science communication internship.
And I'm Jeff Warren. I'm a research director and one of the co-founders of Public Lab. And I guess we'll probably be getting into more about Public Lab's approach to community science in the session. But I work in the space sort of between formal and informal science. And I'm excited to be here.
It's wonderful to see so many people, 23 viewers right now and across the world. We have a really important topic today because, as we know, climate change is something that's going to affect us all. And so while the science behind it is sometimes complex and it is researched on in departments at universities across the world, people should get involved in the collection of the scientific data and in analyzing it and visualizing it and communicating it, because that's the only way that we will understand how these shifts in society are going to, how do you come into the process? How can you be an active partner in addressing the climate challenges of the future? And without community science, I just don't see how that's going to happen, because the more involved we are, the more likely it is that we are going to contribute. And in that sense, community science is a combination of knowledge production and democracy. And I think that that's a fantastic new development. And I'm going to invite Jeff maybe to say a few words about his work at Public Lab first, and then Britta after that to say a few words about her own research.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. As I said, Public Lab is sort of at the juncture between formal and informal science, and what that really means is, although citizen science sometimes has this sort of as Rajesh mentioned in the discussion that we taped earlier, has this reputation of formal scientists asking the public to help them do their research, which is great, I think. But there's also this other element, and that sort of is what we try to get at in community science, which is that communities, especially those who are facing immediate environmental problems or immediate problems where they need at least access to scientific knowledge, but maybe more broadly, they need to be involved in the knowledge production. They have a lot to offer as well. They have local expertise. They have a deep understanding of key problems. And so rather than see it as a one-way street, Public Lab is interested in figuring out how each group, and there's not just it's not a clean dichotomy. There are many different people with different agendas here, but in general, each group can bring something and get something in this sort of exchange. So, sorry, there's a train going by. Yeah, so actually a lot of the things that I was hoping to discuss and get into were about exactly how those exchanges are negotiated and how people's roles play out in a space where there's recognition that science hasn't done all that it can to engage in problems that people really need answers on, but vice versa, that completely grassroots approaches to this aren't legible and aren't well integrated into formal science processes. So to try to figure out a space between that, because I think we don't see them as being opposites, but we see them as being, complementary, really strongly complementary.
Britta, on to you.
Great, yeah. Thanks for that introduction, Jeff. So I think I'll probably just start off with sort of my personal exposure to citizen science, because I've had kind of brushes with citizen science over the course of my scientific career. And it really started back when I was in undergrad in college. And the professor that I was working for in his lab, he was looking for ways to make his science more approachable to the public and get more of an audience. And so he thought, well, I measure organic compounds in natural water samples, so why don't I measure a compound that people are interested in? And so he settled on what he called spices. And so what the project turned into was he encouraged people to send in water samples, and then in his lab he would measure compounds like vanillin and cinnamic acid and thymol or thyme. And he used this information to have these public presentations where he would tell people about, seasonal patterns in vanilla consumption. So like, look, in the summer we have lots of people eating ice cream, or at Thanksgiving we have lots of people eating thyme. And I thought that was a really interesting way of bringing the public into the scientific process, because people are engaged by collecting the samples, and that the results are something that are interesting and relatable. And this project grew into something a little bit more substantive, where they started measuring a broader suite of compounds, including things that are considered more traditional pollutants, like personal care products or plasticizers. And I just really like this, the development of this project as something that brings the public in. But in a sense, it was more like what Jeff and Rajesh were saying earlier about sort of the traditional citizen science, where it's a researcher coming up with an idea and then asking the public to contribute to that. And so the idea of community science and having more of a community-based focus of the research, where maybe a group that's facing some kind of resource extraction wants science to help them collect data and determine how this is going to affect their environmental health, would be hopefully where the citizen science movement is headed in the future. And I think there's some evidence of that. Just right now, there's an annual conference of citizen scientists, and this year they said that they want to focus on making citizen science relevant and useful to more communities. And so hopefully this is the direction that things are going in. Obviously, it's very important to have people, or it's very useful to science to have people around the world collecting data for research projects. But in order to get a larger segment of the population to care about this and to really participate in a way, in a long-term way, I think people are going to want to be more directly involved in the planning stages of these projects. And so that's something that I think climate science is really well poised to do, because not only does climate science rely on data, long-term data records from places around the world that may be very remote, it also depends on people's local knowledge of things that are changing in their own environment. And a scientist sitting off in their lab, somewhere in Europe or on the East Coast doesn't know what's going on the ground. And so those two communities really need to come together and figure out what the priorities of community-based science should be.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Britta.
Yeah.
That's great. Let me just throw out a provocative thought here, right? Which is that even if you look at how software and app development has moved in the last 20 years from being a tool for engineers to being user-centric. So where a lot of development is done taking a designer's point of view, and especially a user-centric designer's point of view, right? That it's the problem that's faced by the user that's being addressed by the software designer. And I'm thinking that could we think of community science a little bit as a user or community-centric view of scientific design, right? Where we address the challenges from the point of view of the eventual community or individual who is affected by the climate challenges that are in their neighborhood. and then use the scientific method and its rigor to plan and solve the problems that come up.
I was going to say, I like the parallel to user-centric design. There's actually another field called co-design, and I know Sasha Kristanzachuk had taught a co-design course at MIT. I think the course is still going on, but I'm not up to date on it. But and it's sort of a field of or literature about a design approach which, although user-centric design draws people in and engages them, it still sort of maintains this designer-user boundary in a way that in some ways mirrors the sort of researcher-subject boundary. And although that can be really key in certain types of interactions, I think that in many ways at Public Lab we're looking for other relationship schemas, so to speak, where instead of thinking of a community who has a problem as a group of subjects, not that I'm saying anyone on this call is doing that, but generally thinking of them as part of the problem domain. Co-design, very broadly, I'm paraphrasing, tries to develop, as Britta suggested, problem definition or study designs that derive from a deep understanding of the problem. And what I like about that is that, Sarah Harding writes about how the sort of fundamentals of science preference certain viewpoints, and she points out that one of the major areas that's left out of the debate about how subjective the science process, the science methodology, or sort of big picture science is the selection of, she calls it problematics. So actually defining what are the underlying problems that science chooses to engage with. And that's one which doesn't necessarily happen within the scope of a research paper. It may happen at the point where you're going out to look for funding to do research, or at the point where you are more informally discussing and throwing out ideas with colleagues. And so it's less part of the traditional script of how science progresses. But that means in some cases that it may be the most, to me it seems like one of the greatest opportunities from where people can work together on the very beginnings of sort of this cycle of science. To choose a problem that may answer a question that is of immediate concern to a group of people, specifically people who don't feel like they are served by science. So that's, I think, an exciting part of it. And I do think there are parallels to user-centric design. And just to sort of wrap up, maybe, there's a process we've been engaging in a lot, which is, rather than drawing people in to our software systems as contributors in the sense that we're saying, you're an ideal user, can you sit down and run through our software and tell us what you like and what you don't like? What we're doing is we're trying to engage people in a little bit more than that, which is to say, instead of saying you are like an example user and we're going to try to observe you and infer things, we're asking people, we're saying that actually the demanding of new features, or the pointing out of problems and bugs, or the envisioning of a new way that something might work, or even just being critical about how something does currently work, is actually the beginning and the core of the work that we do in software. It's not like we do a bunch of software and then we show it to people and stuff bounces back. It's like we have to capture and celebrate questions and doubts and ideas and things that people have, and that really is the generator of all the things that we try to do with our software. And that, I think, that reflects a broader view across public cloud.
That's great, Jeff. I just wanted to put a plug. There's a new book out from MIT Press by Ezio Manzini. I think it's called Design When Everybody Designs. So I'm just going to put the link in right here. And I think that more and more people are engaging with this issue of how to bring communities into the design process, and not just for science, but also for other things. So.
Yeah, I think, just to jump in, I think when we talk about, how can we make more people want to get engaged with the scientific process, it's almost a cultural challenge that we face, because, the trend over the last century has been for science to become more and more of a compartmentalized practice, and it's a profession instead of a hobby like it was, hundreds hundreds of years ago. And so I think it's really cool to see things like the maker movement and the things that Public Lab are doing, which are getting people to explore their curiosity and become interested in science independently. And then when they hear about things, you know, in the news that involve science that are important to society, like climate change, then they feel more of a personal connection to those sorts of events, and they might be more enthusiastic about participating themselves.
Fantastic. Talking about people being engaged in wanting to do things themselves, I know that we have been thinking a lot about challenges that people can start working on right away. And Jeff and Britta, when we did our pre-webinar interview, a couple of those challenges were mentioned. And do you want to talk a little bit about things that people can just get into right away and start hacking away on?
Let me just interrupt 1 second. I'm gonna drop off in a second, just from video. But we've got RDD, somebody who raised their hand, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but I'd love to just bring you in. So you should feel free once I do that to, if you want to chat, we can take you back off. But you are now officially part of the webinar. So here we go with participatory side of things.
Okay.
There he is. Hello. Is that Robert?
That's Robert.
Hey, Robert. I don't think we can hear you. You're going to have to unmute. Which I think if you hover over your window, it will.
Yes. It
should do that. The bottom left.
Bottom left, yeah.
Seen it.
There we go.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Was that Mark Brown?
Yes. Hi, Robert.
Yes. Just one comment to you. You mentioned this Office of Digital Learning.
Yes.
Were there other things to discuss? Was this within the context of what's happening now about climate change, or is this suggestions for future Office of Digital Learning collaborations with other groups?
Yeah. I think we're absolutely anything. We're open to anything.
Okay. Anyway, to go back to the topic, I was just working out first of all how one raised one's hand, so I thought I'd take on that thing and see if it worked. What intrigues me is what the citizen science is trying to do, in the sense that, of course, it can do all sorts of things. I'll just take an example. If you think of the way mobile phones are now used in, say, Africa or India, I mean, they have become a major method of communication for farmers to, you know where to buy stuff or where to sell their products, about prices, weather, and so on. Is this citizen science going to be similar? For instance, I just read today, I think it's from the Yale Climate Change Communication website, it said 2 billion people have never even heard of climate change, you know, whatever it's translated into every language of the world. And for instance, it did mention India, Egypt, and Bangladesh as places. Now, could it be that if those farmers could be engaged in feeding in their own problems of growing crops, this would not only help understand climate change in that regional sense within India, but it will give them some power to change their situation? Is it that this citizen science could possibly give people power to change a situation, or would it be just, you know, that ever increasing data bank for the future for big data to analyze? I mean, has anybody any comment on that?
I'd love to hear from Britta as well. I know that in Public Lab, we're I would say much more interested in near-term action and results of data collection. And part of that is that we work with different communities who are actively campaigning to change anything from the application of existing regulations on industrial or pollution sites or land use near where they live. For example, to close a landfill, halt or at least more tightly regulate a coal terminal, to directly engage and change the world using newly produced knowledge. And I think that's the source of my and generally of Public Lab's interest in people helping to frame problems and collect data which directly relate to a problem rather than submitting it.
Are you finding that helping in the US?
I think in some cases, absolutely. There's a number of cases that we've worked on where people have essentially monitored a site and caught someone polluting and publicized or gone to regulators with that evidence. A lot of it's been photographic evidence. That's in a legal sense in the US, it's an easier form of evidence to produce and defend. But we are seeing the opportunity to, and in some cases the application of digitally or other otherwise scientifically prepared data to sway a case. And we actually have a blog series about this. I'll drop into the chat. It's just kicked off, but it is looking at how evidence plays a role in local environmental action. We're calling it the Environmental Evidence Project. And it's a very difficult thing because regulations can be so particular to a given place.
Oh, sure.
But what we're looking for are openings, opportunities, and sort of low-hanging fruit, as well as existing case studies of when this has happened to try to replicate those.
But the other thing I'm also seeing is that this citizen science involvement makes people's brains think, say, about climate change in this way. In other words, whether it's really useful data input or not, it's getting people to consider the issues and, let's say, raising political awareness, which is definitely what we want. So there are all these different possible reasons for doing citizen science, and it's not just one big lump.
Yeah, and I mean, to your comment about, many people around the world haven't even heard of climate change. They may not be familiar with the concept of global climate change, but say if they're a farmer
or experiencing it, yes.
Bangladesh, right? They're experiencing it. Then maybe they have lots of observations of the fact that their fields are flooding with salt water from year to year. And so what Jeff was saying about using this type of information, using citizen science produced data to affect regulatory or legal outcomes, I think is the perfect application because maybe those farmers could use data that they collect and they work with scientists to make sure that it's, rigorous and conforms to the regulatory requirements to show that they are being damaged by, effects like sea level rise. And that could potentially get them some sort of benefits or compensation from their government. And another good example of people using that sort of approach with citizen science is there's the program. I have to look up the information right here. I can paste it in the chat as well, for people to monitor evidence of methane releases at fracking sites.
Yeah, sure.
And so that would be a great piece of evidence if they want to prove that some industrial activity near them is potentially causing harm.
Yeah, I mean, as you may have read, in the north of England here, the government has overruled the local council to say fracking shall happen. And there's a huge amount of protest. So this is just the sort of thing those people could be doing, isn't it? So we're probably worse than burning coal by doing fracking.